Welcome to the EmberMap podcast. I'm Sam,
I'm Ryan.
and this is, I guess, this is episode 5.
5 or 6.
5 or 6. Let's not get too optimistic. Today we're going to be talking about Ember Data. So it's Monday. Last Friday we shot off an email at sometime in the afternoon, I think. And we said we're going to be recording a podcast about Ember Data. And I guess everyone was just feeling like finally they had a place to vent. It was like we became everyone's therapist.
Yeah.
Because the emails just started rolling in.
We got a lot of replies.
Which is cool. It's good to engage with the community and figure out, people's pain points. I mean, that's part of why we're doing this is to surface things that are really problematic for Ember developers and talk about them and hopefully come up with good solutions and recommendations. So.
And one of the reasons we chose this topic is this is a topic that we struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
We have trouble with Ember Data, with APIs and relationships, and we wanted to just sort of get our thoughts out there. And
definitely, I think it's we've talked about this before, but I think initially a lot of Ember Data was modeled after other libraries and other environments, and the reality of async data loading on a client application and all the complexity there turned out to make it a much harder problem to solve than maybe originally it was conceived of when Ember Data was first written. And then over time it's grown and evolved, and there's been some good changes, but still tackling the problem holistically. I mean, even just the variety of responses that we received in the emails, and we'll compile those up and share those with everybody. But there's just a lot of angles to this thing. So sometimes I think, kind of stepping back at a high level, I think one of the reasons Ember Data has gotten a lot of criticism or is actually causes real problems for developers is because it is trying to do a lot of things and it touches so many areas of your application, right?
it touches a lot of things, but not only that, it's let's look at Active Record, and Active Record is using SQL, so it has like a known target. It's easy to write, not easy, but you can conceive that it's easy to take something that takes a bunch of objects and turns them into SQL queries. But with Ember Data, like what is the target there? Like we have Json Api now, but not everyone uses Json Api.
Json Api doesn't even account for everything. There's still parts of the spec that are not conceived of yet.
What about a different, not every Ember developer gets to control their backend. What if your backend is using grass-fed, handcrafted API endpoints? Like, it's really hard for Ember Data to come up with a general pattern that can accommodate everyone.
Right, and have abstractions that won't leak through to those other areas, because it does touch everything. So,
and the reality is, it does leak.
Right,
it leaks everywhere, and that's where the frustration comes from.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the way I think we approach this. And when we think about Ember Data, we have experience with working with something like Active Record that solves, 95% of the use case. And we see once we become productive with it, the benefits are huge. And so I think it's easy to look at something like Ember Data or have a bad experience with it and say, all I want is $.getJSON and let me just maneuver this stuff like I want to. And yes, in the short term, that's going to help you. But, if we do iterate towards a solution that is going to get us to that 95% case, the way other ORMs have in other frameworks, we believe that there's huge benefits to that.
Right.
So that's why it's worth the pain of going through trying to standardize things or model things in a slightly different way than you might if you just had your own go at it in order to unlock those benefits.
Right. But that's a really great point, because ORMs, they leak. You can't write everything you can write in SQL in an ORM. But it's a 95%. You can write 95% of your app's SQL statements in an ORM, and that's gonna make you super productive.
Yeah.
And so getting our JavaScript API clients to that point gonna be huge.
Yeah. And even getting JSON API written has been huge.
Yes.
Like, imagine what it was like before that, and that was only 2 years ago. But when we started using JSON API for everything, it made a huge difference.
I mean, backend code, API controller code is like it's 5% of my time.
Right.
95% of my time is front end code these days.
Right. Okay, so I think there's a lot of responses and there's a lot to talk about. We're just going to focus on a few of the big ones. I think async loading in general is like the big umbrella topic here.
Yep.
And this is like what we wanted to talk about before we even had the idea of emailing the list. So what do you think about async loading?
Never. always define your relationships as async false. And, it took me a while to realize why it's so much easier. But say you're looking at some member code and you see like post.get comments, and you know that the relationship is a post has many comments. So you see post.get comments. What is that code doing? And you can't really tell the developer's intention if the relationship is async. So post.get comments, it could be fetching comments from the backend. It could be returning comments that have already been fetched and then triggering a background reload. Or if it's a sync relationship, it could be returning an array of comments.
So here, first let's step back. When we say an async relationship, what does that mean? Because part of the confusion around communication here is what does that even mean?
Yeah, great point. So async relationship is actually, why don't you answer this one?
I think the problem here is people are mixing the technical definition of async, what it means to be async true or false in Ember Data, with a UI pattern of asynchronously or lazily displaying or fetching data. That's not part of the initial page render. So people are building something like a blog post page, and it shows the text, and then they want to say something like, when I scroll down and click load comments, I want to show the post comments. And so now I definitely don't want to load those comments in the route because I don't need them to display the post. So I definitely want those to be async, right? Because that's what that means. It's like we're going to load them asynchronously outside of the normal router model flow. And so what we've learned is like that's a UI pattern, and it's very important to distinguish between the UI pattern and what the details are of making an Ember Data relationship async. So there's ways to accomplish the pattern of progressively rendering data in different parts of your screen while still not using Ember Data asynchronous relationships.
Right. So when we say async true, it's Ember Data async relationships. Maybe we should use a term like lazy loading
for the UI pattern.
For the UI pattern. So I want to load a blog post, immediately render the page once the blog post is loaded, and then maybe lazy load the comments when the user scrolls down to the comment section.
Right. So then the next thing is good to identify and establish what setting async to true actually does. So what are the effects that it has? So if you have a post that has a comments relationship, it has many. If async is false, then post.getComments is just going to return locally what's in the store, right?
Yep.
And if you have async true, again, which I think it was named in this way to support these kind of lazy UIs. And so what it does is post.getComments will return what's in the store if it's there, or make an AJAX request if it hasn't loaded it yet. And also the return type of that object is now different. Instead of maybe being an empty array or an array of comments, it's now a promise proxy, which is something that wraps a promise and it proxies to the content underneath so that certain parts of the Ember architecture can comprehend it, right? So a template can comprehend both a model and a proxy to a model.
So if you did something like, comments.length, it wouldn't, a promise doesn't have a .length method or a .length property. So that would proxy through to the relationship. And there you could figure out, okay, how many comments do I have? How many comments are loaded? So that's a benefit, or that's the original thinking behind the benefit of promise proxy.
Right. And the idea here is like you don't have to think about loading necessarily. And that's kind of part of our what we don't like about it is that really when you're building these apps, you should be thinking about loading, and you should be thinking about the ways a user can get to a particular page and how they should load data if it's already loaded. So,
the problem is you're still thinking about loading because you're thinking about, okay, when I do post.get comments, what am I getting back?
Right.
And you might not be thinking about, oh, like where in the life cycle of my application are the comments actually loaded, but you still have to think about, okay, am I dealing with like an array? Am I dealing with a promise? So it doesn't solve the you don't have to think about loading problem.
Right. It's like an idealistic thing where when you do post.comments.length in the template, maybe you don't have to think about loading. But as soon as you write a computed property, that's like a map of those to their authors, and then you get something. Now all of a sudden, it's very easy for this abstraction to leak, the promise proxy abstraction to leak. So we find that problematic. We find that that's difficult to teach, and so the references API came out as a way to try to help this. If you have async relationships, you can use references to never trigger side effects by accident, whether by trying to get a relationship. But and we've had some success using those. But again, I think in general we prefer, if we have control over everything, to just go async false, and that still lets you do this kind of lazy UI fetching pattern just by loading relationships off of their links or off of known endpoints that you have, because usually you have these endpoints that you already know about. And so if you want to get a post comments, you can do that in a couple of different ways, right?
Yeah. So the thing that I find interesting about references are references let you, like, you can access the data that's already been loaded, but they give you a different API for that. So you can't do post.getComments. It's post.belongs to comments.value.
Or post.has many comments.
Yeah, post exactly.
Either way,
has many. The thing is, though, it's like I'm only loading comments in like one or two places in my app.
Like a route,
or maybe like you
scroll concurrency
in,
task.
Yeah, the comment section scrolls into the viewport, and a component kicks off a fetch. I'm accessing comments a lot more,
and so I really layer and computer properties,
and the
controller and templates.
Like, so I don't want a new API around accessing, which is what references is. I want a new API around loading, because loading I'm only doing in one or two places.
That's a great point. And everywhere else in our system, and just in general in JavaScript, accessing properties with get or even dot syntax, like that's how we access data. And you expect if something's not there, it would just return a null, right? And we've talked about this before. Like if you don't write a model hook and then you start doing model.firstName, model.lastName in your templates, and those are blank, it's like, oh, okay, I forgot to load the model hook. I forgot to write a data fetch in my model hook, so I'll just go figure that out. But those null values are a signal to the developer, right? But like you want model.firstName. That's an expressive way to say display the first name of the model property. But then when you load, we use a different API, store.findAll, store.findRecord, right? So what we want is something similar for relationships, because really it's just another aspect of the same thing, which is loading data.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And store is great API. Like I've never had a complaint about store.findRecord or store.findAll.
Right.
Yep. Right. I mean, there's some nuance here. We had some emails about, why does findRecord or findAll return synchronously after you've loaded data the first time and then trigger a background reload? Like we've definitely been bitten by that. And sometimes it's just, again, there's no clear affordance all the time what's going on there. But in terms of having separate APIs to express what the intent is, I think they nail it, right? You want to express, hey, here I'm loading data. Hey, here I just want to show what I have already on the client. Right. So I really like that distinction. And that's why we like async false, because post.getComments will be get the post comments. Give me an array of the post comments. Whatever we happen to have loaded in the store. So it's really this idea of separating whatever you do. It's really, you want your program to clearly communicate the separation between loading data and fetching and displaying data, loading data and displaying data synchronously.
So one interesting thing here is, okay, so say you do async false and you don't use these async relationships. How do you lazy load stuff? So how do you lazily load the post comments when the user scrolls to like the comment section of the page?
Right. So you can use a store API. You can use links. So the store API, you could say, fetch me all the comments with the post ID of 1, 2, 3. And where would you write that code? You could write that in an Ember concurrency task, let's say, on a controller. what we do a lot of times is pull that stuff out to the model, because really what you want to say is something like post.load my comments,
Right.
or post.load this relationship. It's really like the way JSON API expresses relationships, where you can do find me a post and include its A.B.C and its D. That's what you want. Like, let's say I already have a post, but I haven't loaded those relationships. Let me load them now. So you really want an API that understands the relationships and understands how to load them, and ideally understands when you've already loaded them, how fresh they are, right? This is something else we've talked a lot about with a store. There's many times where, you call store.findAllPost, and you want to know later in your application lifecycle, it would be really nice to say, oh, hey store, can you tell me the last time you loaded all, or have you ever called find all on the posts, right? This happens a lot when you're displaying like a list of posts on the home screen. You click one and then you go back. What if you start on one and then you go back to the home page? Sometimes it'll show the one and then it'll pop in with all the others. And if you could access some metadata about the store, you could really prevent that from happening. You could say, no, I only want to render the index route once I've called store.findAll at least once. So in a similar way, there's a lot of times where we want to say, look, the users come into the application through this path. In this route, they loaded a post and the comments, and now they're going to end up in this new place. So we've already loaded a post and its comments. So does that mean we want to load them again? Do we want to force them to reload before displaying anything? Or are they visiting this route for the first time? And so we need to get the post, the comments, and all the comments authors, right? So this is why this problem is so hard, because moving around a stateful application, there's just so many ways to get to every template, and you don't know what's been loaded or how to load things. So I think what we've come to, at least where our thinking is right now, is you want to be as declarative as possible, right? The idea of being declarative is a really good thing, because you can delegate the actual work of loading data to the system. So if you say, this template for it to render needs a post and its comments, this template needs a post, its comments, and its authors, and then you can let the system figure out how to wire that up. That's like a really good solution.
Yes. Yep. And let's talk about the add-on that
so we've been toying around with this add-on that we started out with just as an in-repo add-on, a couple projects, and it gives us a couple APIs. So it gives us a .load method on models.
This is a way that we can use synchronous relationships, but still get lazy loading. So all of our relationships are sync, but we have a .load method, so we can say post.load comments. That's going to be a promise, so that gives us all the promise behavior. But then if we say post.get comments, that will be the underlying data there.
And do we, for .load, are we basically just delegating to references API, so the has many comments .load, right? Because that will basically use any information the store has about how to find those, whether it's links or...
Yeah, so our implementation right now, we're using store.query. So we use store.query, but there's a million ways you can get here. And I think this should be something that, this is sort of like where you get to color in your application, how your app is going to load comments. So I think this should be like a per developer, per application definition.
Right, but there's a really easy way to basically define, okay, when I need to load these relationships, here's how you do it.
Yep, and it could be, you could imagine it could be like $.ajax, it could be, JSON API with filter. You could reload the post with a JSON API includes. There's so many ways to load these relationships, and again, you want the developer to be able to define these.
Right. The more important point is drawing the boundary around the part of your code that loads it, so that we can leave the part of the code that accesses it the same.
Yes, exactly.
And so once you fill those in, then every Ember app will access data exactly the same way.
Yep.
And that's really good.
And we found this led to another API that we use in our apps called must preload. And what this does is we have it's basically a template level assertion that says, if you're rendering this template and these relationships haven't been loaded, then there's something wrong, and we throw an error in development mode, not in production.
Right.
In production, it would just be, if post.comments wasn't loaded and you got to this code, post.comments would be empty array.
Right.
But this is good because this forces us to think that, okay, this is like a synchronous component. This component isn't going to do any data fetching. It's not going to do like the flash of unstyled content where the list starts out empty and then it fills in, half a second later.
Right.
So this is an awesome API, and this is how we catch the bugs of, there's so many ways to access data in your application. There's so many paths to data in your application. And this is sort of the way that we say, okay, by the time you get here, I don't care what path you came from, you had to have loaded data.
That's really good. So like you're writing a form for a new post and you need all the categories loaded so that you can categorize this post. And you've written this form, and the only way this form can render is if that data is already loaded. And so this little template assertion is going to let the developer know who, 6 months from now when they're trying to render this thing and it can't load data on its own. Now you could write components that know how to load data on their own. You could still do that. But there's a lot of times where you just want them to delegate data fetching to their parent. And this is basically a way to express that that's what's happening.
Right. Because you could argue like, oh, it's really good that if a component doesn't have its data, it just knows how to go and fetch it. And like, okay, yeah, from like a system point of view, that's great. But from a UI point of view, that's awful because now the screen starts flashing, things start moving.
Right. As you break your UI up into components, if everyone was responsible for fetching its own data, then it would be very hard to orchestrate things to make it for a nice UI.
Yeah. It's like the banking website you log into and you get 6 loading spares.
Right.
So we want to say that, when you're rendering this block of components or this component, you've got to load it somewhere else. And Ember gives you the tools to do this. Like you can throw it in the route. You can use
You can throw it in the route if you want to block.
Yeah.
You can use a task if you don't want to block. The point is that you want APIs that support all the UI patterns, and you can decide. It's really about being clear and expressing your intent.
Yep. And then the last benefit here is that you get to write components that operate in like a synchronous world. So my form component knows that it doesn't need to account for all these cases where like, categories aren't loaded.
Mm-hmm.
It knows that when I get rendered, I'm going to have categories, and that gives you those assumptions make it so much easier to develop these components.
Because you only have one state to worry about instead of 3 or 4.
Right.
And we know that that's like...
And when you multiply that across, one route with 4 or 5 different components,
you're done.
Yeah, you just want one state.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the way that this works under the hood is with one more API that we added, which is called hasLoaded. And this is basically just keeping track of your .load calls, right? And so it's nice because it piggybacks off of Json Api. So if you do post.load comments, author, it's going to remember that. So if you've actually done post.load comments up here in route A, you've done post.load author here in route B, and then you click on a link that brings you to route C, and route C's template says, or maybe a component gets rendered that says you must preload comments in the author, then it'll work, even if you didn't load the data.
Right. It knows you loaded them it knows you caught something else called .load before, and it lets the assertion passes.
Right, exactly. And then your route, you can do, return post.load, and that will have the same behavior as the store where it returns it synchronously, so you don't have to wait. And then that could refresh in the background, or you can configure that to do other things. But if you visit that route for the first time, it would load that stuff fresh and it would block rendering.
Yep.
So it's all these tools that let you build these APIs in an expressive way and don't trip up on whether things are, you're not dealing with promise proxies, you're not accessing data in any different way. So,
like this is an add-on that we use. It's an in-repo add-on, and we do want to open source this at some point. It's written, for our apps and our particular style. Like there's a lot of assumptions. If you have a async relationship, this won't work.
Right. A single async relationship.
A single async relationship. And I think that most Ember developers have async. I mean, it's a default.
Yeah, it is a default, and I did a poll on it, I remember. And I think it was broken up. Yeah, the very small minority, 10 or 15 or 20%, were all async false all the time.
And that's us.
That's us, right, exactly. So I think our goal with this, and we do want to open source it, like you've started working on open sourcing it, and we should share it with folks. I think our goal should be to have people experiment with different ways of fetching and accessing data in their app and show these patterns.
Yep.
And it's all backwards compatible with Ember Data, so you can drop it in and, except for the fact that it forces async false. I mean, that's something we could make that you could override, but that's just kind of the idea of like constraining which APIs we want you to use from Ember Data. But ultimately, this would be something that we would want to be able to use with any Ember app that uses Ember Data, right? So that's important to us. Like, it's not about rewriting Ember Data. It's about taking the best parts of Ember Data that we love and using a constrained set of patterns there that we don't. So it's not, you're not guessing how to do things.
Right. So, Ember Data causes a lot of friction, but it's also, there's a lot of thinking and a lot of experience that's gone into Ember Data. So to throw that all away as we need something new I don't think that's the right approach. So
I agree.
Building APIs on top of Ember Data that follow these patterns, like sync access, is that's sort of where we want to go with this.
Definitely. It goes back to, it would be easy to do get JSON here in your app, but you throw away all of the stuff that you get by having the identity map and your flat endpoints and all, It's worth struggling to fit your app into those patterns because there's so many benefits and accumulated knowledge from those patterns.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about a few more things from the list. Some things I have down here. One of the other ones that was hit on was store forking. And we actually also have an API in our add-on that kind of deals with a similar thing, which is the snapshot. And the idea here is, Ember Data is really good at reading in your responses into an identity map. So you have, a single canonical record that represents, let's say, a post with ID 1. Anytime any data on that post changes, the changes are reflected everywhere in your application, which is great a lot of times, but sometimes it's not.
Right.
Because what you want is something different.
Right. So let's say, you're logged into your account and you update your first name, and there's like your icon status menu in the top right hand corner. I update my first name and that thing automatically updates. So it says welcome Ryan to welcome Ryan too. And that's magical.
Right.
That you get that for free. So that's great. That's where the identity map is awesome. The area where it hurts is imagine you have a list of blog posts and you go to add a new blog post, and all of a sudden this like new empty item shows up in your list. You're like, where did that come from? It's like, well, yeah, you created a new blog post, so we're going to display it, even though it's not saved. The backend doesn't know about it. So you always do like these hacks. You're like, oh, okay, my list of blog posts will be all the blog posts filtered by ID, and I know if they have an ID or like not
filtered by is new is false.
Yeah, and then like I know that if they have that, they can show up there. They're persisted on the back end. And what we really want here, or what we think we want, is this concept we call store forking. So give me a brand new store, a brand new identity map that has all the same data, and let me add stuff to it. And then my list of blog posts on the screen will be using the old store. Not the old store, but like the current version of the store. And when I'm creating new stuff, I'll be adding them to what we call the forked version, or this new version of the store. And then when I'm ready to save, I save all my data, persist on the back end, and then I merge these two stores together. And at that point, my list of blog posts will update and I'll see that record. And I didn't have to think about, filtering by is new or filtering by ID or anything like that.
That's really an awesome way to think about it, of what you're doing. And again, it goes back to being clear about your intentions and being expressive in the code, right? When you're building that index template, the developer is thinking, right, I have the list of canonical posts that are saved in my backend. That's what I want to derive this list from. So what you really want is when you go to that form, you're like, give me something completely new, right? This form represents client-side state.
Right. And what people do here is they'll like, oh, maybe I'll only work with a Pojo, and then when I'm ready to save, at that point I'll create a model, and I'll create a model based off that Pojo. So my component for creating a new post is just going to work with like
it's a JS object.
Yeah, a JS object of the post data, and then when I'm ready to save it, I'll create the model, save it, and that will show up in the post. But again, like I don't like doing that because you're creating a new post model. You should have that post model right from the beginning.
Right. It should be first class in your app. It's like
because you might want to access stuff like relationship data or just methods,
computed properties.
Yeah.
So that seems like a non-starter to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely done that, and it's fine when you have like,
Username
title
and password
date.
or something.
Yeah, username and password. It's fine, but as soon as you get, you want to start like wiring up a bunch of relationships, that's when it starts to fall apart.
Right. So what we have just to solve an immediate problem that we made was this Snapshot API, where it's really just about rolling things back. And it doesn't actually solve the problem kind of the ideal way that you stated it, which was having a separate store completely that you can display and mutate data from. But what this does is it lets you kind of take a snapshot of a model, and once you start editing it, if the user wants to cancel or discard those changes, it can let you easily go back to an old graph. And now Ember Data does have this API built in that write rollback attributes. So it is keeping, in a sense, two versions of a model as soon as you start changing it, because you're able to roll it back. So it's keeping that somewhere. But we don't have public access to it, really, right? There's not real public access to that old snapshot.
I think we might. I'm not sure. One of the issues is like, what if I take a snapshot, make some model changes, save them, make some model changes, save them, and then like, oh, actually, no, I want to roll back to like 4 saves ago. Our Snapshot API lets you do that.
Right.
And then also too, rollback attributes is not for relationships. It's for attributes. So generally, when you're doing a rollback thing, you have a whole graph that you want to restore.
Right.
And that's sort of why we wrote this. And also, in the past, we have done, with our drafts, we've done the concept of forking the models. So creating a bunch of new models that don't populate the store, and then merging them in when they're saved.
Right. So that's a nice pattern too, but we've stepped away from that just because of the complexity. You basically subclass a post, you call it a draftable post, and it is in the store, but it's just not as a post. It's called a draftable post, so it doesn't affect the rest of your API. And then when you hit save, you're actually just doing some jiggering in the adapter layer to have it go back to the canonical post route. So when it comes back, it gets pushed into your canonical post model type, and then the UI updates. And like that really works well. Like it feels like it's 50% of the way awesome, and then 50% of the way just breaking down.
But that is one of the reasons that I won't shut up about store forking.
Yeah.
Because that was so easy to work with.
Yeah.
And as a developer, I never had to think about the store or these
cleaning up
half-created
things.
models.
You could just throw them away when you were done with them.
Yeah.
And it's great.
So getting to a world where we have that, if I could use that on every app, I would be super excited.
Right.
Yeah. So another thing that came up, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, is bulk operations with Json API. So, you're creating a new blog post, but you're also creating a new category for that blog post. So you want to kind of do that all in one HTTP request. Create the category and then create the post all in one go.
Right.
And we've had this, we've had the need to do this. We were building like an order system, and you want to like open an order, create a bunch of line items, and then, close the order basically. Right. And we just wanted one post request, an order with like 5 line items, and that thing would respond with
yes or no. Basically,
yes or no,
I was successful or not. Because if you break it down into each constituent request, you have to code, error handling and different UIs for every possible failure.
Right. So today with Json API, like how would you do that? You do a post to create an order, and then a post to create a line item with like order ID that you just created, and then each line item would do that. And there's something interesting that happens here is your backend gets into a state that's basically impossible. So let's say that you post the order, and that like 200s, that's okay. And then you go to post a line item, and something goes wrong, like the internet goes out, or your backend just can't handle the line item, and that 500 errors. Now your backend is in the state where it has an order with no items in it. And that doesn't really make sense, right? Like, how could you have an order with no items?
Right.
And, just thinking about like what we did to code this, like we would create the order, add the items, and once all the items were successfully created, we'd then do like a patch to the order.
Right.
And we'd say like, finalize at, and that would be a new date. And that would tell the back end, okay, start, like the order is all set up. You have all the pieces you need, start processing. And again, like
this is really a workaround. I mean, it's really not an ideal way because it's not a model of the actual real world thing that's happening here, which is just a single transaction.
Right.
That happens to create multiple things.
Right. So like, think about like how a database would do this. It would start a transaction, try to insert all these records, commit the transaction, and if any of the pieces failed, it would tell you would get an error in your code.
The transaction would roll back.
Right.
And so you'd be in that initial state with an error, a single error message. Or you'd finish everything and be in the completed state.
Complete state, everything's there. Yeah, and then we get this question a lot with Ember Data. I think this was one of the most popular responses to your email that you sent out last week. This is something that we, like I said, like we struggle with, and sort of like the order example where you finalize it is sort of the best. That's the best solution, I think, right now.
Yeah. The only other example I have is I was working on an app where you could like reorder multiple questions, and there was a lot of operations on multiple models of a single type. And there, I think it's not too tough. You're still going to be handwriting some code, but if you wanted to say, instead of creating 10 questions individually, you would just send a single post request to /questions, and you would send over an array of JSON API documents. And then you could, on the back end, take those 10 elements of the array, which each contains like what you would normally send to a single endpoint, and then create the 10, and then return them as an array, and then in your adapter, like iterate over them and push each one into the store. And like that was like not a lot of code, and it lets you do, get already works, post, patch, and delete to multiple records. Again, it's not a standard, it's not a spec, so it's not future-proof the way the rest of our JSON API code is. But for that app, it made sense. Like if I was building Trello, doing the individual atomic HTTP operations is just not it's not really a possible solution, because you're reordering cards and so many things are changing. So you really would have to, at that point, I think, handwrite some solution to take care of that endpoint.
Yeah, absolutely.
So unfortunately, there's not really, a good answer here yet. I think the folks who work on JSON API and supporting libraries have this front of mind. And so I'm confident eventually like this will have a solution, but right now you're kind of on your own. I mean, that's just the reality of it.
Yep.
Okay, well, there's a lot more we could talk about. Obviously, I think we'll probably talk about Ember Data at some point in the future on the podcast again. We do want to respond to folks who've emailed in and share with the list some of our other answers to the questions. And we'll also be sure to let everyone know when we do post this library. We make it open source. You've been working on it a little bit.
Yeah, I've been working on abstracting it from the two apps we're using it in.
Nice. So maybe we'll talk about that sometime soon when it's ready for folks to test out. So that's kind of exciting.
Cool.
Awesome. All right. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.